I'm delighted to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr Peterson, Professor of History and African Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Professor Peterson's research focuses on the cultural and intellectual history of Eastern Africa. Formerly Director of African Studies at Cambridge University, he's been active for many years in building research collaborations with Africanists based in Africa, and in fostering publications of the research based on those collaborations. His current projects include work on the preservation of government archives in Uganda and the digitization of 70,000 photographic negatives held by the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation. It was this photographic project that led to his co-curation of the exhibition that forms a focus of tonight's lecture, The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin. Professor Peterson was awarded a Macarthur Fellowship in 2017. Also known as Genius Grants, the MacArthurs recognize transformational scholarship in the recipient's fields of study. Genius is a designation that connotes a lone scholar separated from the wider community of researchers. I'm pleased to note that Professor Peterson's collaborative research profile defies and makes nonsense of that simplistic stereotype. His generosity and flexibility in offering the RHS tonight's lecture is warmly appreciated. Derek, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure and a great honor for me to be asked to give this lecture for the Royal Historical Society. I've been a fellow of the RHS since the time I taught at Cambridge University, and it's a pleasure now to be able to repay some of my debt to the Society. Thank you in particular to Professor Margot Finn and to Catherine Boxall and others who have been involved in the curation of this event. This paper is arising out of a shared research project and curatorial project that draws me together with three distinguished and well-mannered colleagues: Nelson Abiti, who's curator for ethnography at the museum in Kampala and a PhD student in the University of the Western Cape; Edgar Taylor, lecturer in history at Macarthur University; and Dr. Richard Vokes, professor of anthropology at the University of the West of Australia. This paper and the exhibition that it describes is co-authored by the four of us, and all of the curatorial work around this project was done jointly with these three colleagues of mine. In 2015, researchers working in a storeroom at the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation opened up an undistinguished and unremarkable filing cabinet. Inside were thousands of photographic negatives, set on end, packed in glassine envelopes, labeled and arranged in rows. Each of these packets held, in many cases, dozens of negatives. In all, there were 70,000 of them, most in the medium format. They were made by photographers who worked with the Ministry of Information and the Uganda government, with what was then called the photographic section. The vast majority were made in the 1970s during the presidency of Idi Amin, one of Africa's most notorious rulers. The negatives have now been digitized as part of a preservation project that brings together my university, that's the University of Michigan, with the University of Western Australia, and with UBC, and with colleagues from Macarthur University. In May 2019, we opened an exhibition at the Uganda Museum in Kampala that's drawn from this larger collection. On display were 150 images, which we paired with a sound and video installation drawn from material that we had also digitized from UBC. The exhibition we titled The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin. The exhibition is Uganda's first memorial to the Amin years. There are no monuments to honor the many people who perished during the political tumult of the 1970s and early 1980s. There are no plaques, there are no statues or designated sites of mourning that encourage discussion about or remembrance of the traumas of that time. Even the paper records of the 1970s offer scant opportunities for those who wish to reflect on the period. At the National Archives, there are at the moment 5 members of staff. Until very recently, most of the archive's holdings were disorganized and therefore inaccessible to researchers and students. So the new availability of Idi Amin's photographic archive has opened up all kinds of novel possibilities. Here's an archive that's prolific and extraordinarily rich. Tens of thousands of pictures documenting occasions of great significance across the whole span of Uganda's history. And yet the material and political deficits that delimit public discussion of history in Uganda today have also imposed themselves on this photographic exhibition. In Uganda's public life, there are few resources with which to work in crafting an account about the Amin years. In the absence of ready-made collections to draw upon or recognized victims groups with which to work, we as curators have really had to struggle to craft an exhibition that's both ethically responsible and also politically salient. Over the course of the past decade, a number of the world's leading ethnographic museums have closed their doors, reorganized their collections, and launched expensive and high-profile efforts to reconceive their public exhibitions. In Berlin, the Humboldt Forum is nearing the date of its opening. The building was erected at the cost of over 70 million US dollars. It's a reconstruction of a grand Prussian palace. It's meant to house the redisplayed collections of Berlin's ethnographic museum. The Royal Museum of Central Africa in Tervuren was reopened in December 2018 after a renovation project that cost $85 million and ran for 5 years. Throughout the renovated museum, the curators have placed art installations alongside ethnographic items. That's how European museums are distancing themselves from their colonial history. The lavish expenditure of public funds, the strategic deployment of art is for these institutions a passport out of the dead end of the ethnographic museum. The oldest museums of Africa were, like the great ethnographic museums of Europe, conceived as places to display the artifacts of primitive life. And through the changing tides of history, a remarkable number of ethnographic galleries have survived in African institutions. Until very recently, for instance, the National Museum of Kenya had at its center Joy Adamson's multi-part painting, Peoples of Kenya, which depicted dozens of Kenya's peoples typecast according to their ethnic attire and according to their facial profile. Ethnographic objects were organized in glass-fronted display cases around each painting, that is, the accoutrements of each of Kenya's tribes were available for viewers to see. The Uganda Museum opened its current building in 1954. At its core was the Ethnographic Gallery, formerly called the Tribal Hall. It's organized around a series of wooden display cases, each of which holds objects that derive from the traditional cultures of Uganda's people. There's no information in the display cases about the provenance of the objects, about the prior lives that they've lived, or about the circumstances in which they came into the museum. At the time of national independence, there were halting efforts to reconceive this and other African museums. In Ghana, in West Africa, there was a new national museum opened in 1957 during the ceremonies that marked the country's independence. In the gallery, there was a collection of stools, which had formerly been associated with the power of Ghana's chiefs, around which were organized photographs, life-size photographs of Kwame Nkrumah and his cabinet ministers positioned above each of the stools. In Uganda, there was a new hall, the Pavilion of Science and Industry, that was opened the day before national independence in 1962. The year following, there was a new exhibition about Uganda's television service. 123,000 people came through the doors in 1963 in the space of 3 days, by far the largest visitation that the museum has ever had in its history. Today, the energy that once animated these and other renovations has largely dissipated. Ghana's National Museum has been closed for 10 years. Statues of Kwame Nkrumah and his successors in Ghana's presidency sit in a kind of assembly behind the museum building, piled up in the garden. In Kampala, the Ethnographic Gallery, which was laid out in the late 50s and early 60s, can still be viewed today. While Europe's great museums are spending their way out of their colonial past, in Uganda, as in many other places in Africa, There are generally, with some exceptions, no multi-billion or no multi-million-dollar budgets to finance renovations. Neither are there wide open spaces to reconfigure inherited exhibitions. Things have to be done cheaply in conditions of material austerity and political uncertainty. Innovations have to be pursued in tight corners. This afternoon, I want to describe one small effort to reconceive, or at least to open up space for political history in an African museum. Spatially and organizationally, the Unseen Archive of Idi Amin turned its back on the ethnographic architecture of the Uganda Museum in Kampala. There were new floor tiles, which was a way of setting off the exhibition from the rest of the institution. The media were new. The exhibition opened with a timeline. Every photograph was carefully set in a chronological context. There were long text panels explaining what was happening in each photograph. In this exhibition, history displaced ethnography as the guiding logic of the displays. The transformation of these vivid and evocative photographs into historical evidence was, for us as curators, quite discomforting. We were obliged to organize the exhibition around categories that didn't correspond with the logic of the archive itself, or with the inherited architecture of the museum, or indeed with the experience of people who had actually lived through the 1970s. We had to wrangle disputable, dreadful things into containers, finding unifying themes that were both ethically responsible and politically expedient for us. All this work was done in constrained circumstances with limited materials in a place where there was much that cannot be said. These constraints imposed themselves on the exhibition, shaping both its form and its content. History was made at the Uganda Museum, but not in circumstances that we might have chosen. From the time of its foundation, the Uganda Museum has been made to make do with less. There have never been big budgets to finance the acquisition of historically singular artifacts. Collections have been built circumstantially out of things that were left over. A number of the materials that are on display in the ethnographic gallery today were formerly court exhibitions. That is, they've been seized by the police as evidence during investigations into a crime that had been committed. Once the case was closed, the evidence could be remaindered and handed on to the Uganda Museum, where it was put on display in the ethnographic gallery or incorporated into the collections. So, for instance, the majority of the spears, arrows, and bows that are now held by the museum were, in a former time, murder weapons. The ethnographic collections grew dramatically after Uganda's independence in 1962. A great many things were, all at once, made obsolete, out of date, or disposable. Under Uganda's first constitution, there were a number of kingdoms, ancient kingdoms that were recognized in law, which had their own kings, their own palaces, their own legal systems, and their own police forces. In 1966, the Prime Minister, Milton Obote, who was determined to build up power in his own hands, sent in the army to crush the palace of Uganda's leading kingdom, and thereafter he amended the constitution to abolish all of Uganda's kingdoms at once. That's why the Uganda Museum faced a sudden inflow of objects that had formerly testified to the power and prestige of Uganda's kings. There were crowns, regalia, gowns, and other material that came into the museum and were incorporated into the collections. The core displays in the ethnographic gallery were laid out in the late 50s and early 1960s. In the words of the curator who did the designing, they were an effort, as he said, to provide a microcosm of the traditional life of Uganda. Some of the things that were put on show were actually dreadful objects covered in blood and gore. Other things that were put on display had once been testimonies to the power of kings. In the museum, they were stripped of their biographies. Curators labeled each artifact as though it were representative of a particular cultural group, then put it on display in the display cases alongside objects that were similarly labeled. That's how the ethnographic gallery was built, by reframing discredited and inherited things as if they recognized an ancient ethnic tradition. Whole ways of life and whole ensembles of cultural practice passed into the museum's custodianship in those years, and visitors flocked through the doors. In those years, in 1969, there were, for instance, 152,000 visitors over the course of the year. This was the high tide, really, for the museum's professional curators. Today, after 3 decades of power, in power for Uganda's government, the National Resistance Movement, headed by Yoweri Museveni, the president, today, after three decades, it's much less clear what the public role of the Uganda Museum ought to be. The Museveni government came to power in 1986 after a long and taxing guerrilla war. The architects of its government regarded Uganda's conflicted history as a hindrance to progress. They sought to direct citizens' attention toward the promising future, not toward the dark and divisive past of the country. This leaves scholars and students of political history with a very small space in which to work. In 2011, a powerful government minister proposed to seize the land on which the Uganda Museum was built and erect upon it a new skyscraper. The skyscraper was designed in London. It was meant to be the highest building in Africa. There were meant to be something like 22 floors with space for 12,500 people. The Uganda Museum was meant to occupy 1 floor in the skyscraper right above the shopping market. That proposal's been shelved thanks to a campaign to save the Uganda Museum. Nonetheless, the museum remains in a precarious position in public life. Visitor numbers are much smaller today than they once were. 40,000 people per year come through the museum's doors. Most of them are school students. The museum doesn't possess collections with which to develop an expansive account of Uganda's past. The stores were disarranged during the tumult that followed after the overthrow of Idi Amin's government in the 1980s. When a consultant came in the mid-80s to report on the state of the museum, he found that there was much that had been ruined by rain because the roof had failed. In 2016 and 2017, my colleague Nelson Abiti and I worked with the staff at the museum to organize a series of events to encourage public reflection on the future of the collection. There was a 4-day conference involving curators from South Africa, Ghana, Michigan, and from Uganda. Thereafter, the following year, we held a series of seminars at Macarthur University to discuss the museum in the company of smart and distinguished academics. These and other occasions generated a great number of ideas that could drive the renovation of the collections. The difficulty, from the curator's point of view, was the absence of material with which to work. The museum's storerooms were largely, although not entirely, empty of objects that could address key moments in the country's past. It wasn't clear in those years how, if at all, a tumultuous and controversial history might be represented. The photographic collection at the UBC opened up a whole new set of possibilities. Here's an archive that's overflowing with abundant, well-composed photographs of historically important events. All the pictures were made by men who worked with Uganda's government in the Ministry of Information in what was called the photographic section. No other part of Idi Amin's government, or indeed of any Ugandan government, was more dedicated to precision and record keeping than were the people who created the photographic archive at the UBC. Notwithstanding the richness of the collection, though, it's clear that the men of the Ministry of Information worked in severely constrained circumstances. Today, the photographic archive at the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation includes about 60,000 pictures that were made during the presidency of Idi Amin. Very few of these pictures, less than 100, have ever been printed or published. Why were so many pictures made but never published? Under Idi Amin's dictatorship, photographers found themselves in an exceptionally perilous position. In those years, a great number of people, we think as many as 300,000, were murdered, many of them killed by Idi Amin's men. This violence targeted innocent people who fell afoul unknowingly of government edicts. Photographers were, because of the nature of their occupation, uniquely unable to control their own fate. Once they handed over a picture to an editor or to a publisher, photographers couldn't control how the picture would be displayed, where it would be placed on the page, what the caption would say, what the headline would say. For some cameramen, this was a death sentence. The perils were made particularly clear in July 1976. That month, Israeli paratroopers landed in Entebbe airport and freed a plane load of Israeli hostages that had been held by the Palestinian Liberation Organization. During the course of the attack, the Israelis shot up the airport and killed a number of Ugandan soldiers. Right after the attack took place, men from the photographic section came to the airport and took pictures of the scene. Some of those pictures were sent on to Drum magazine in South Africa, which published an account of the Israeli air raid at Entebbe on its pages. Idi Amin saw the Drum magazine report and flew into a rage when he saw it and ordered the execution of the people who had made the pictures. The photographer who made the pictures went into hiding, but the man who sold them to Drum magazine, a man named Jimmy Parmar, was executed by Amin's men. Thereafter, Amin's operatives came to the photographic section building on Nile Avenue in Kampala and spent a month going through the cabinets where the negatives were kept. They pulled out the pictures of the Israeli air raid and the events that followed after it, along with a great number of other pictures that they thought to be objectionable. And over the course of the month that they were there, they incinerated all of the objectionable pictures. After these events, the head of the photographic section placed the entire archive under lock and key in a strong room at the back of the UBC building. After 1976, the pictures generated by the photographic section were, with only a very few exceptions, kept out of view. The photographers continued to take pictures, but once the negatives were developed, they were placed in those glassine sleeves, labeled, placed in a drawer, and locked away. The UBC archives were made by men who were terrified that the pictures they took would make them into the targets of Idi Amin's unaccountable wrath. Even so, they were obliged to ensure that they documented everything. President Amin came to power at the head of what was called a government of action. For every social problem rather, there was a campaign, targets were set, people were mobilized, rallies were held. All these things needed to be recorded for posterity. The need to document the accomplishments of the time obliged Uganda's government photographers to be careful about their work. Whether out of fear or out of conviction, they had to ensure that the pictures they took faithfully reflected Idi Amin's achievements. A great many pictures had to be edited out. The people who worked in the darkroom made the first cut. As the negatives emerged from the chemical bath, the darkroom workers examined each of them with a magnifying glass, weeding out pictures that were poorly focused. In none of the photos that we've found in the UBC archive is President Amin shown sneezing or grimacing or chewing with his mouth open or blowing his nose. There was another round of editing after the negatives had been developed and labeled. We know that a whole month's worth of photographic negatives were removed dating from June and July 1976. The negatives are numbered sequentially across the whole archive, so you can tell what's missing. We know that those negatives from June, July 1976 were removed in the month following the Israeli air raid and the events that followed after it. We know also that there are a lot of pictures missing from February 1973. It was during that month that the Amin government ordered, or rather conducted, a public execution of 12 people in the center of Kampala in a public occasion that was viewed by thousands of people. Did the photographers take pictures and subsequently destroy those photographs after they were made, or did Idi Amin's men remove those pictures in July 1976 from the archive as they cleaned up the collection and made it presentable? We don't know when they were taken away. What we can say is that the UBC archive has been trimmed, culled, and edited over the course of years by a great many people. There are tens of thousands of pictures that remain. They've survived the tests of time because in the eyes of the people who had editorial authority, they were uncontroversial. They made no one nervous. They reflect a kind of consensus among the image makers of Idi Amin's government about what Uganda's posterity ought to know about the country's second president. In January 2018, the UBC launched a project to digitize this photographic archive. As the scanners began to reveal the richness of the collection, we opened up discussions with the Uganda Museum about the possibility of an exhibition drawn from the archive. It was unclear to us and to the museum's curators about how those photographs ought to be made public. We were very much aware that the pictures, presented uncritically, could make Idi Amin's campaigns against the regime's enemies appear to be justified and in the common interest. Today, in some circles, the memory of Uganda's most infamous ruler is being rehabilitated. On social media and in other platforms, critics have begun to compare his government favorably with the current government of Uganda. Uganda has the youngest population of any country in the world. Less than 5% of Ugandans were 15 years or older at the time the Amin government fell in 1979. For the vast majority of Ugandans, the Idi Amin government is out of living memory. The violence of Idi Amin's government, the torture and murder of dissidents, criminals, and others who fell afoul of the regime, largely took place out of public view, in remote army barracks, in the hidden basements of government buildings, or in dark forests. It doesn't leave an obvious trace in Uganda's public records. During the 1970s, Amnesty International, the International Committee of Jurists, and other international agencies produced damning, sensational, and specific depictions of state violence. In Uganda's government archives, by contrast, violence can really be only seen obliquely or at a tangent. Thousands of men and women were tortured and killed by agents of state, but most of the killing was done off the record. It's been difficult, therefore, for victims of the Amin government, people who suffered loss, to find their voice. There's very little infrastructure with which they can work to develop an account of the times. There's a website called The Atrocities of Amin, whose organizer has collected information about hundreds of murders that were committed by Amin's government. There's a very small set of autobiographies composed by men who were tortured and imprisoned by Amin's soldiers. There are no victims groups for people who suffered in the 1970s. There's been no Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Uganda. With a few exceptions, the dead have not been made into martyrs. The meanings of their deaths, the larger cause for which they died, remains cloudy. The UBC's photographic archive is largely empty of material that depicts violence in the 1970s. In curating the Unseen Archive of Idi Amin exhibition, we had to find ways to make the experience of suffering, death, and torture visible. Working from an archive from which so much had been amputated, we had to create visual prosthetics that could bring terrible things back into view. We settled on a timeline as a way of encouraging viewers to see the 1970s from a variety of different vantage points. The timeline occupied the hallway that viewers passed through as they entered the exhibition. The top row of the timeline depicted great events of state. The middle row offered photographs of President Amin's domestic life. In the bottom row, we placed photographs of murdered Ugandans, organized by date according to when they were murdered. So for instance, here's the 1972 part of the timeline. The top picture depicts President Amin and his colleagues in front of the Brandenburg Gate in February. The middle row depicts Idi Amin's children singing for the radio in September 1972. And the bottom picture depicts Benedicto Chiwanuka, who was murdered that same month, taken out of his law chambers by intelligence operatives and murdered shortly thereafter. Here's the 1977 column in the timeline. The top picture shows President Amin's birthday celebration at Nile Mansions on the 1st of January, 1978. The middle picture rather, depicts the wedding of President Amin's most notorious associate, Isaac Maliamungu, who was married in 1977 or 78. This is his wedding photograph. And the bottom picture depicts Archbishop Janane Lumwun, who was murdered by Amin's men in February 1977. Our goal in organizing the timeline in this way was to remind viewers about the strong undercurrent of danger and sorrow that lay underneath the celebrations that the Amin government organized. The rest of the exhibition was likewise organized to bring the violence of the 1970s into view. Along the long axis of the hall, we set up a series of rooms that viewers passed through. One room featured photographs of, among other things, the 1972 expulsion of Uganda's Asian community, during which 40,000 Asians who had lived in Uganda for decades, many of them had lived in Uganda for decades, were obliged to pick up and leave their homes given the space of 3 months to depart. The pictures we put on display in this section of the exhibition were made by government photographers in 1972 as a way of dramatizing the iniquity and self-interest of Uganda's Asian community. We used them to depict, we thought, the pathos and danger and fragility of the time. Another part of the exhibition, one of the rooms that we set up, depicted a series of photographs that were made in 1975 featuring witnesses, or rather people who were tried before the Economic Crimes Tribunal, which was a military tribunal set up to try civilians who were accused of hoarding, smuggling, or overcharging. The penalty for a guilty verdict was death, and it's almost certain that the people whose pictures we put up in this part of the exhibition were murdered, were executed, that is, shortly after the photographs were made. The extraordinary power of these photographs derived from the humanity of the people whose fate was being adjudicated by Amin's officers. They were photographic evidence of the arbitrariness of justice and the cheapness of life. The last part of the exhibition featured a selection of photographs from the State Research Bureau. The SRB was the most notoriously brutal part of Amin's government. In the basement cells of its building, hundreds or perhaps thousands of Ugandans were tortured and murdered. The pictures we put on display were made in April 1980, about a year after the fall of Idi Amin's government. By that time, the bodies had been cleared away, but nonetheless, the photographs captured the menace of the building. There were bundles of clothing scattered on the floor, pools of blood sunk into the ground, marks on the walls where people had once rested their battered bodies. The photographs of the derelict building brought into view the otherwise invisible spaces where so many people had met their end. They invited viewers, we hoped, to populate these empty rooms with images of the brutalities that had occurred here. That was how we repurposed the UBC photographs. We needed to undo the earlier editorial work that had rendered violence largely invisible in the archive, and we arranged the photographs in a way that we hoped would open up windows into the hidden brutalities of the day. Even so, it was really difficult for us to get a conversation going about the violence of those times. We organized a series of panels featuring individuals whose lives were intertwined with the Amine government. These panels were televised live on the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation, so Ugandan viewers could see them. They were meant to promote public engagement with the exhibition and to give voice to a variety of different kinds of experiences through which people passed through the 1970s. One of the panels we organized, we titled "The Victims of the Amine Regime," and it was exceptionally difficult for us to put together. Several participants who had agreed to take part withdrew at the last minute, not wishing to parade their private grief in front of a public audience. In the end, the panel featured the daughter of the murdered politician Nekania Balanuka, the daughter of the murdered Archbishop Janani Lumwoon, and a prominent Indian businessman of Indian extraction, who had been exiled by Amin in 1973. Two of the participants in the panel told moving stories about the loss of their fathers, about the sorrows that had attended their growing up, and about the support they'd enjoyed from relatives and kin. The businessman, by contrast, focused largely on his personal enrichment during the early 1970s. He talked about the commercial opportunities that suddenly opened up after so many of his colleagues were sent into exile. Not surprising that he had to face hostile questions from the audience, as people were quite indignant about his pursuit of wealth in this harrowing time. There was no readily available script which our panelists could use. Neither was there a community of fellow sufferers with whom they could speak. The unevenness of the panel discussion and the difficulty we had more generally in setting up the exhibition in a way that brought violence and victimhood into view, these things highlight the absence of templates with which to describe the 1970s from the perspective of those who suffered. Our panelists' experience in the 1970s were intensely personal. They hadn't been routinized. They hadn't been rehearsed or cleaned up. As organizers of the panel, we had invited people to speak in a register they hadn't practiced. The exhibition was on show in Kampala for 8 months in 2019 and early 2020. We had 8,000 adults who passed through the doors. Thousands of school kids came too. Ugandan viewers were invited to give feedback on feedback forums. They were generally surprisingly delighted about the exhibition. A great many people viewed it as something like a family photograph album. They looked for pictures, that is, that represented people who they had known and loved. One person found his father in one of the photographs. He had been the first trombonist in the Uganda police band in the 1970s. Another visitor, a businessman, found himself in this 1978 photograph. The picture showed him offloading a consignment of cattle from London in the Entebbe airport. For these people and for many other people who found their relatives in these pictures, the photographs were a welcome addition to the family photographic archive. Not everyone, though, regarded our exhibition, or our strategy at least, curatorially, regarded it favorably. The most interesting critique came from a Ugandan artist named Matt Kyan, who published a review in a Nairobi-based art journal. Kyan argued that we as curators had ignored, as he said, quote, all the positivity in the images and chose to cover them with soot. Most of the photographs in the exhibition, as he noted, were uplifting, showing merrymaking and beautiful moments, as he put it. But we curators were, as Kyan wrote, hell-bent on reminding you of the 300,000 people who were murdered by that dictator. He thought that we, as curators, like so many people before us, were bent upon discrediting Idi Amin's government. Matt Kyan's perceptive review put its finger directly on the key problem that we faced. 40 years ago, the UBC archive had been edited to eliminate visible evidence of violence or inhumanity. This editorial work channeled what subsequent generations could see about Idi Amin's presidency. We felt that we had to undo this earlier editorial work to encourage Ugandans to view things, to look for things that weren't immediately visible. That's why we laid out the exhibition in a way that foregrounded the experience of victimhood. We felt that we were obliged to deprive the photographs, at least in some parts of the exhibition, of their power to impress and persuade. It was in our interest, politically and intellectually, to organize the exhibition in this way. The museum is a government institution. Its place in public life, as I've suggested, is insecure. It cannot be seen to champion the memory of Idi Amin. Since its formation in the mid-1980s, Yoweri Museveni's government has contrasted the chaos of Uganda's past with the promising future ahead. Any attempt to lift up the memory of Idi Amin is therefore a challenge to the current government's account of history. Those dangers were made particularly clear to us in November 2019, when an angry visitor confronted our attendants at the exhibition. The visitor accused one of the attendants of betraying her people and her government. How could she, a person from Western Uganda, support an exhibition that elevated Idi Amin, who had murdered so many people from the west and south of the country? The man said that the exhibition was a disgrace and an insult to Uganda's president, and he vowed to contact highly placed people in government and raise funds in order to buy the whole of the museum, ensuring that the whole thing was closed down. Now, we don't know who this angry man was. His threats never amounted to anything, but nonetheless, they open up a window into the perils that the museum confronted in organizing this exhibition. The man recognized that a stereotype of Idi Amin as a murderous, brutal tyrant was politically necessary in Uganda today. The darkness of Uganda's history is an essential way of securing the contemporary political order that helps make the ruling regime appear indispensable. We needed to protect the museum from the accusation of political disloyalty. So we organized the pictures in a way that the last images in the show, which positioned on the wall as viewers left the hall, featured a young President Museveni. The photos were made in 1980 during the election campaign that followed immediately after President Amin's overthrow. The arrangement of the pictures made it seem as though Yoweri Museveni was the solution to the violence and degradation of the 1970s. This was, of course, as everyone knows, historically inaccurate. Idi Amin's government was followed immediately by another government, Milton Obote, which was even more brutal in many ways than Amin's had been. Museveni didn't come to power until 1986. Nonetheless, the historical fiction that we visually created was a way of covering up politically the exhibition against the accusation of political disloyalty. We needed to identify the museum and ourselves as curators with something like an authorized account of Uganda's history. That's what, for us, curatorship entailed. It meant bending a compromised and deeply edited archive to serve purposes which it was never meant to fulfill. We had to conjure up storylines that fit within the limited spaces with which we could work. The exhibition was on show in Kampala until January 2020. Thereafter, we installed it in 2 provincial towns. In Soroti, in eastern Uganda, we put up a smaller version of the exhibition in a newly opened regional museum. The exhibition is still there in Soroti for those who might like to go and see it now. In Arua, in northern Uganda, the town management gave us the use of the social center at the center of the city for the space of a week. And we put up a temporary exhibition which went on display there in mid-February. In the provinces, the corners in which we had to work were even tighter than they'd been in Kampala. In Kampala, where so many people had suffered in the 1970s, we could expect that people would view propagandistic and uplifting pictures with skepticism. Arua, by contrast, was the cultural and political heart of the Amin government, and our audience was inclined to view the exhibition as something like a vindication. One afternoon, members of Idi Amin's family came at our invitation and with our encouragement to view the exhibition. They lingered over the pictures of Idi Amin with his family, stroking the pictures affectionately, and thereafter they very kindly took part in a panel in which they discussed their memories of their brother, father, their relative, the person who they had loved. On another afternoon, several dozen Army veterans from Idi Amin's military visited. Some of them came several times, bringing personal photographs from their military service to show us. The veterans viewed the UBC exhibition as evidence that their military service had been honorable and creditworthy. In Arua, more than elsewhere in Uganda, the legacy of Idi Amin's government is a debatable issue. In the years after Idi Amin's overthrow, a great many of his ex-soldiers went into exile in Sudan and in the Congo. The government of Milton Obote, which returned to power in 1980, conducted a bloody campaign against the people of northwestern Uganda, and a great many innocent people died in the 1980s. In 1995, the region was again at war. There was a rebel group led by one of Idi Amin's cabinet ministers who launched an insurrection against Yoweri Museveni's government. Today, the rebellions are at an end, but the politics of Idi Amin's legacy remain unsettled. We laid out the exhibition in Arua much as we had done in Kampala. In one part of the hall, we put up a wall full of pictures depicting President Amin's visits to Arua and other parts of northern Uganda. These pictures were generally celebratory, depicting Amin in fellowship with the people from whom his family had come. Directly alongside those photographs, we placed dozens of pictures from people who were under trial by the Economic Crimes Tribunal in 1975 in Bombo outside Kampala. Arrayed on the wall, the pictures of executed people were a silent witness to the violence of the 1970s. They acted, we hoped, as something like a visual counterweight to the pictures of celebration, dance, and song. The point was to encourage viewers to stumble over the division between the register in which these photos were taken, to shuttle between contexts, political and moral, to look at things from more than one angle. That was our hope. For some people, it was quite difficult to know what to say. Moses Ali, the Deputy Prime Minister of the government of Uganda, was in the tightest corner. General Ali was very, very generous in agreeing to come to Arua at our request to open the exhibition, The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin, in the town's social center. For years, General Ali had served in Idi Amin's cabinet. There are hundreds of pictures of him in the archive of the UBC. He was generally thought by diplomats to be Idi Amin's most capable minister. After Amin's government was overthrown in 1979, General Ali led a guerrilla army made up of former soldiers of his regime in a campaign against the subsequent government of Uganda. After Yoweri Museveni came to power in 1986, General Ali, after a short time, returned to government as a minister. In the 1990s and 2000s, he served in a number of cabinet posts. He's one of a very few figures who served in the Amin government and who were subsequently returned to prominence in public life. And this political rehabilitation has encouraged him or obliged him to exercise quite strict control over his autobiography. On the morning the Arua exhibition was to open, General Ali asked me for some assistance in drafting his opening speech. When I arrived at his hotel, he gave me a sheaf of papers. The text was drawn from his unpublished autobiography, And it was largely about his military service in the 1960s as the leader of the Army's paratrooper unit. I read the material, it's very interesting, and I talked to him about it. Wouldn't it be better, I asked him, if he talked about his service in Idi Amin's cabinet or about what the 1970s could teach Ugandans about politics today. General Ali refused these suggestions, and over the course of a few hours, I put together some text, he edited it, he wrote some of it, and at the opening of the exhibition, he read it out, speaking at great length about paratrooper training and saying almost nothing about Idi Amin's government. It was a lovely speech, which said almost nothing about this controversial and unsettling subject. In Kampala, in Arua, and elsewhere in Uganda, there were limits to what our exhibition could do, and there were limits also to what people could say. As we planned for the Arua show, we approached the relatives of a man named Michael Ondoga, who had been Minister of Foreign Affairs in Idi Amin's government, killed by Amin's men in March 1974. One morning in 1974, he was dropping his daughters off at a primary school in Kampala. Amin's intelligence men had apprehended him, stuffed him into the boot of the car, and driven away. The following day, his brutalized and disfigured body was found floating in the Nile River. We asked Michael Ondoga's aggrieved relative to speak on a panel at the Arua exhibition about what had happened to their relative. The relatives refused our overture. If they were to be involved in a public discussion about the 1970s, they said, Idi Amin's relatives would need first to come to them to ask for forgiveness. There could be no dispassionate discussion until the injustice of their relative's death had been resolved. The unseen archive of Idi Amin was born in a tight corner. It was hedged in by constraints that were both political, infrastructural, moral, and political, and material. At the Uganda Museum, there were small historical collections to work with. The photographs on which the exhibition had to be based were full of details about important events, but the UBC archive had been edited. It imposed its own limits on the exhibition. Whole arenas of public life were obscured by the editorial work that Amin's men had done. As curators, we had to create visual prosthetics that could stand in for unseeable things. It was a way of bridging over the limits of the archive, pointing toward domains of experience that were otherwise invisible. None of it was ever enough. For the late Ondoga's relatives, as for those we invited to talk about victimhood in Kampala, a museum exhibition, however carefully we laid it out, was an inadequate vehicle to address the outrages of Amin's regime. Instead of judgment, we could offer discussion. Instead of rectification, we could offer recognition. Instead of outrage, we could offer a space for cool reflection. Instead of compensation, we could offer publicity. And instead of redemption, we offered dialogue. It's worth remembering that the Latin root of the word exhibition is habere, to hold. An exhibition is an offering, something that's held out, but it's also a withdrawal, something that is kept within the grasp. An exhibition is, among other things, an enclosure where terrible and dangerous things can be made safe for public viewing. Thank you very much indeed for your time and attention.
Derek, that was an amazingly powerful and an extraordinarily timely lecture for us. It resonates with, in so many ways, not only nationally, but globally, with where we are as humans and as historians. So I'm enormously grateful to you for that. Thank you so much, Derek. My current running order begins with John Earle, who's asked whether you can say more about why discourses of violence dominate the top 2 layers of the exhibition, and are it's providing its dominant paradigm, and might that reinforce some of the older colonial tropes about violence?
Yeah, okay, so those who went through the exhibition in Kampala, which will include colleagues who are part of this call, who are in Uganda or elsewhere, will be aware that while violence was certainly a theme that we tried to surface, it was by no means the only organizing principle. In fact, it wasn't really the predominant organizing principle of the exhibition. The point of the lecture was to say that we really had to work to bring violence into focus in an exhibition which was otherwise full of pictures that uplifted the Indian government for reasons that I laid out in my talk. The parts of the show that I didn't speak to in today's lecture pertain to other dimensions of the 1970s. We wanted viewers, as I said in my talk, to look at the 1970s from a variety of different points of view, to kind of shuttle between contexts and learn in some sense, to encourage reflection that was not limited to one point only, but that opened things up for discussion. So we included, among other things, a cinema section of the show where viewers were given a 20-minute film based on materials from the UBC that we had digitized, which was largely about media and how media helped to create an image of Amin that was operational and active in public life. We used also radio recordings, which were broadcast through the whole exhibition hall during the course of the show, which were made up of material from Radio Uganda that had been broadcast in the 1970s, and largely consisted of speeches made by Amin or music or other such things that went across the radio. So if anything, media was the predominant theme of the exhibition, quite deliberately. We're working with a media archive. There was a room in the exhibition hall that was set up in a way to bring Amin's engagements with cultural work into focus. As that part of the show made clear, Ugandan artists, musicians, dancers have never had a better time, really, have never enjoyed more support from government than they did in the 1970s. The 1970s were really the high tide of state sponsorship for Uganda's traditional arts. So these are all dimensions of the 1970s that we sought to bring out. In this lecture, I focused on our efforts to bring victimhood into focus because it was a particularly vexed issue for us as curators that required lots of work to surface in that sense. I don't think, to answer John's question directly, I don't think that the exhibition reiterated images of post-colonial African violence. If anything, the exhibition was meant to show that the logic of the times, that there was a logic to the times, and that people had good reason to support and be enthusiastic about it.
Thanks very much, Derek. Our next question is from Professor Hakeem Tijani, who is interested in the ways in which we can teach the Amin era, both to undergraduates and to postgraduates, and particularly perhaps the use of these records to do so with a slight coda there. Are they readily available online to all of us, or is that the intention?
So the status of the UBC archive is as follows. Right now, all the digitized material resides entirely in the hands of the UBC. It's not available in an online format in any way, as it's the commercial property of the broadcasting house. The UBC is keen to use the material to generate content for its own broadcasts that will be of a historical kind. And indeed, they're keen also to license material for the use of international broadcasting houses. So we've set up a system which works, it seems to be working to some extent, whereby those who wish to use the archive as researchers or as broadcasters are given a copy of the catalog and then go and enter into a dialogue with the UBC about accessing the archive and there's a license fee that's paid, and the broadcaster or the researcher can access the collection. We're facilitating that process. In fact, I am myself right at the moment, in fact, for a couple of different users. The plan going forward, because this is a bit of a cumbersome access policy that puts demands on archive staff and indeed on us as to act as archivists. The UBC has provisionally agreed to make 1,000 photographs available through an online vendor, which may come to pass. I can't yet announce that it will happen, but we're hoping to involve a commercial vendor in a way that will make 1,000 of the pictures available for students, researchers, broadcasters, and others who wish to consult the collection through the internet. That interface has not yet been set up. I can, in the interim, if you're dying to take a look at these pictures, point to a publication that my distinguished colleague Richard Vokes and I are editing, which is called The Unseen Archive of Amin. It consists of around 250 pictures from the UBC archive, which we've curated, organized. We've written text explaining the pictures. It'll be published early next year by Prestel, which is a photo book publisher in Germany, and it will be a lovely book available for sale for those who wish to see and to use it in teaching or in other formats. There's also academic publications coming out. The paper I gave today, co-authored by Nelson Abiti, Richard Vokes, and Edgar Taylor, will be published in early 2021 on Comparative Studies in Society and History, which is a prominent journal published here in Michigan. And we're hoping that there will be other publications arising out of this project too that will bring the exhibition into conversation with scholarship.
Thank you very much, Derek. Our next question is going to come to you directly from Andrew Ivaska. And I think someone is going to unmute Andrew, or he's going to unmute himself.
I just did it myself.
Thank you.
If I'm coming through. Thanks very much. Hi, Derek. Nice to see you, and really important project. So really fascinating stuff. Thanks. So my question is about performance, and I'm wondering about, in the same way that the relationship between performance and, or let's say performative action and monuments or museums has been brought into an interesting dialogue with everything from Roads Must Fall to the battle over monuments around George Floyd's death, et cetera. I'm wondering how this exhibition might engage those kinds of discussions, and particularly because performativity seemed to be so much a part of Amin's own practice, and indeed the whole media, sort of, that seems one of the reasons why these photos are taken. I'm wondering how the exhibition as a sort of closed museum space, but also one that moves, might engage sort of, people's reaction as performative acts, I guess. I was curious that you talked about the provinces as a tighter corner, but actually one of the things that seemed interesting to me there is it seemed to actually have a lot more sort of relation, sort of vocal engagement, performative engagement between the audience and the exhibit. So that's my question. And then if I tag on the briefest, I was curious whether dignity and shame came up.
Dignity and shame, yes. Thanks, Andy, it's really good to see you. Thanks for that question. Look, as you rightly say, Idi Amin's government itself was very much invested in the creation of its own public memory and in the performance of its own history. So a few folks who are on this call may have attended a lecture I gave in Kampala in February this year about monument building and museum making in the 1970s, which made the argument that the Amin government sought to rewrite Uganda's history as a struggle history by unmaking a colonial legacy that had been built in concrete and focused on the accomplishments of British conquistadors, and which focused instead on Ugandan resistance to British colonialism and elevated a newly recognized cast of characters into a place of prominence in the museums and indeed in stone-built monuments. Amin was an inveterate opener of monuments for him, as you suggested, making monuments and performing traditional dance and song was a way of allying himself and his government with what he thought to be kind of an ongoing struggle against colonial culture. So the performance, those pictures I showed you of him dancing so vigorously, it's worth saying that his predecessor, Milton Obote, was a very, very circumspect, polite, gentleman with a cane on his elbow, and who never, as far as I can tell, danced in his life. Maybe he danced, but if he danced, it wasn't like Amin danced. Amin really danced. And for him, it was, as I said, it was a way of bringing the traditional arts into alliance with this broader project of rehabilitating African history and culture. In that sense, Amin's politics foretell our own time, and our own politics of decolonization today are foretold in Amin's efforts to revive Uganda's traditional cultures and heroes against the legacies of British colonialism. So, our exhibition, I think Amin himself would have been delighted that we are rehabilitating these pictures and introducing them to a Ugandan audience that can engage with them. That delight is that we imagine he would have felt. We've tried to temper by counterweighting the celebratory pictures with pictures that remind people of the violence of the time. But it remains an exhibition which is irresolved. There's not a point that you come away with in which you say that's what we want you to know. We've really had to work to make it something like a balanced collection, a balanced show that allows for a variety of investments and performances and engagements from viewers. It's going on, by the way, I should mention, for those of you who would like to see it in Uganda, as soon as this virus mess dies down, we're going to put it on show in southern Uganda at the Igongo Cultural Center in Barara, where it will be on exhibition, we hope, probably in 2021, given where we are at the time.
That's another reason for us all to hope that the virus is suppressed sooner rather than later. I've got a question next, Derek, from Chris Marsh, who would like you to say something more about the gender ratio, the sex ratio of those who were actually killed under the Amin regime. He notes that you actually have many images of women as well as men, and what that ratio might tell us about the culture of politics during the Idi Amin era.
Yeah, so there's now two projects about that question. One from the distinguished scholar Alicia Decker, who wrote a book about gender and Amin's government. The other by my doctoral dissertation student, Doreen Kembabazi, who just defended a dissertation a month ago here at the University of Michigan about the politics of attire, dress, and abortion in Uganda in the 1970s, 60s and 70s. Both of these projects focus on the ways in which gender was a particular preoccupation for Amin's regime. In many ways, Amin's government was liberatory for Ugandan women. Women, among other things, were placed in positions of authority. The first African woman to become Minister of Foreign Affairs served in Idi Amin's government. Amin made women into permanent secretaries for government ministries, and then endowed them with the power to run those ministries after their ministers were sent down, as it were. Women were drafted into service in the Uganda Air Force and in the Army. They were trained militarily. And Amin made a point of celebrating feminist occasions. International Women's Year and other such occasions were subjects of government backing and support in the 1970s. So in that sense, the Amin government was engaged with the politics of feminist advocacy in the 1970s, probably more than other African governments were, in fact. It was remarkably attuned to the changing architecture of advocacy around this issue, around women's place in public life. Alicia's book and Doreen's dissertation both show that for Ugandan women, the experience of the 1970s outside elite circles was decidedly fraught, as it was for many Ugandan people, for Ugandan men. Alicia's book brings into view the advocacy that Ugandan women pursued as they sought to protect their sons and their fathers against violence, the campaigns that they launched, the protests they organized, Doreen's dissertation focuses on the ways in which women sought to protect their rights over their own bodies by seeking out access to abortion and abortion drugs and other forms of self-care in a time when such things were very much in short supply. So in other words, it was, you know, in answer to the question from Professor Marsh, it was indeed a time with, you know, for women as for other categories of persons, the 1970s were full of, you know, paradoxes in many ways.
Thank you, Derek. I'm hoping you're going to be willing to go until 7:05, and I'm going to try and get at least 2, possibly even 3 more questions in. But if that becomes too much, put me on mute, I suppose. So Yona Matemba is our next question, who's asking, how are Ugandan historians engaging with the troubling history of Amin as it's surfaced in your exhibition specifically?
Yeah, good question. So there's a whole cohort of really smart young students being trained in historical methods at the Macarthur Institute of Social Research in Kampala. And just next door in the Department of History, the history department at Macarthur is enjoying a vibrant new resurgence under the custodianship of my colleague and friend, Dr. Pamela Kanakwa, Mr. Chris Buhosi, Dr. Edgar Taylor, and the chair, Simon Rutabajuka. And, you know, so when I was in Kampala last in February, I had an opportunity to spend an afternoon with the history PhD students, talking to them about their work. I spent another afternoon in the company of the students at MISER, at the Uganda Institute of Social Research. I read their work, I sit on doctoral committees, and I hope that some of them are viewing. I have nothing but admiration and hope for this new cohort of younger scholars. As I mentioned in my talk, it's been very difficult to study history in Uganda until quite recently. Archives have been disorganized or inaccessible. There's been very little material in which to work. Moreover, Uganda's government is inveterately disposed against the study of history, and President Museveni periodically gives speeches decrying students who go off and study the discipline at university. So, you know, those students who have my full admiration are engaged in an uphill task. And yet they're succeeding in writing really interesting dissertations about subjects that engage with history about the 1950s and 60s. And I can't. So there are dissertations about the 1970s that are coming to fruition now, although the 1970s remain a bit off stage for the newest doctoral students who I know at Macarthur. I mentioned my own doctoral student, Doreen Kembabazi. I have another doctoral student here at Michigan, Sauda Nakukenya, who's working on a new dissertation about the history of law in the 1960s and 70s. There's a new PhD, David Ngendo Chimba, who's a friend and colleague, who's just defended a dissertation about the borderlands between Uganda and the Congo. There's Yusuf Senonkuma and others who have written dissertations about the 60s and 70s as well. There's much to look forward to, in other words, if these young scholars begin to finish their work and bring it to print. And I think as resources become available, as new archives are organized and digitized, there will be a resurgence of historical scholarship produced by Ugandan scholars based at Macarthur. And I'm looking forward to that.
So we're going to try and get 2 more questions in before we close. We're going to begin with a question from Ambrina Manji, who has commented how difficult this was to look at and listen, which is, I think, all of us really must have felt very powerfully. She thinks that it's Mohammed Amin in the Wakeroo Lodge photo, but her real question is about the choice of panelists in Kampala, whether you considered someone other than a businessman to speak about the Asian experience of those years. I guess it risks a well-known trap where there are Asian academics, intellectuals who might have spoken or who engaged with the exhibition. And just a heads up to David Ngendo, your question about audience will flow, I think, very neatly from that question from Ambrina.
Yeah. Look, we had, as I mentioned, quite a difficult time putting that panel together. That is indeed, by the way, Amin in the picture that I showed you, of Amin standing in front of a picture of himself with Haile Selassie and Jomo Kenyatta. There's a Canadian journalist standing on one side and Amin on the other side, holding up this big print while Amin kind of edits it. It's part of a series of photos. Professor Manji asked, did we consider someone other than the businessmen to speak about the Asian experience in those years? Look, to be quite frank, we wanted in the panel really to foreground the experience of people who remained in Uganda in the 1970s. Largely, although not entirely, because we feel as though the Asian expulsion were part of the events of the 1970s, or one of the events of the 1970s that was most well covered in the press and that's most notorious about the Amin government. We didn't initially intend really to have a panelist on that panel discuss the 1972 expulsion. We wanted that panel largely to be composed of people who had stayed in Uganda and who had suffered from the effects of Amin's rule in the period after 1972. In the end, though, we recruited the businessmen to speak because the rest of the panel was in danger of kind of falling apart because people had withdrawn at the last minute. And we were a day, I think, before going live on television with the panel and needed to put something, we needed to add a third panelist. That's how we ended up expanding that panel in the way that it did. You know, the kind of hurried character of its assembly reflects the difficulty, as I said, that we had in assembling that collection. It wasn't that we intentionally excluded Asian academics, although we didn't have any panels with academics who spoke about the exhibition generally. It wasn't meant to be an academic occasion. We wanted the panels to be occasions for Ugandans more generally to engage with the exhibition and to learn about it.
So we're going to have one final question, and then anyone who has the bandwidth is going to be very welcome to show their videos so that we can have a proper round of applause after a really wonderful performance and engagement with the questions. David Negendo has a question that's much more sophisticated than the boiled down version I'm going to give you, but it's about how the exhibition's audiences shaped or perhaps distorted what was exhibited and also how it was interpreted. And you can see, Derek, in the chat, a more sophisticated version of that, but I'm conscious of the time. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And again, it links in some ways to the previous question as well.
Yeah, look, we had an audience feedback form that was on offer in Kampala. We got several hundred people who filled out the form, usually quite briefly. And we had attendants in the exhibition who were speaking with people who came through and keeping notes about what they heard, which is all part of our effort to gauge the response to the exhibition. I used some of that material in the lecture when I was talking about how viewers recognized and engaged with the pictures and the responses they had to it. Of course, we've also got material from journalists who went through the show. There were reviews published in 8 or 9 newspapers, including several newspapers in Uganda, Kenya, and international as well. So David asks, is audience a politically determinant in shaping what can be said at these shows? I mean, I think that's true to some extent. The way in which people spoke about the exhibition in Kampala in front of the television cameras, you know, there was a kind of different panels that we organized. We organized 4 panels in Kampala, each of which had its own logic. There was, for some of them, a kind of, you know, brotherhood of arms thing. On another panel, there was a kind of sisterhood of common struggle. That is, solidarities forged in history that shaped how people spoke about the 1970s out of shared experience, even if those experiences hadn't been piped into print or into broadcasts in obvious ways previously. In Arua, in the north, where David was in fact present for a few days, my sense is that there was likewise a kind of solidarity among the audience, an interest, as I said in my talk, in using the exhibition as a prop to push forward a rehabilitated version of the Amin years. And I'm sure that those audience, kind of the context in which the story was told shaped the way in which the story came out. I'm sure, but it's worth saying also that all of these occasions were public occasions in a wide sense. Audiences in our own time are not constrained by locality. There were television cameras at everything we did. People were live tweeting. None of this, if you're thinking about museum audiences as being constrained by language or place, it's no longer true, as I learned this past couple of years. It's very much now an open space in which people have to be aware of the wider world in which their words resonate. Moses Ali was uniquely and is uniquely able to judge the weight of the words that he uses. And his own reserve about his life history reflects this practiced sense of editorial control over his own very rich, very revealing, but as yet untold life story.
Derek, that's been an absolute tour de force, powerful, moving, important, and incredibly timely for all of us. I hate to cut it off at this point, but I think we've exercised you really quite sufficiently. I think that the lecture that you've given will be coming back to haunt many of us in teaching in the coming year. So much to think with. Not only about Uganda and East African history, but many other histories as well. I'm really, really so pleased that you were able to do this for us. And I do think anyone who has the bandwidth to take them off themselves back into video, it'd be very nice if we could give Derek a very well-earned round of applause. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. It's very kind.
Right.